Dawn breaks over the gray waters of the Lingayen Gulf. The sea is restless, littered with debris from the night's bombardment. Smoke rises like thin curtains along the Philippine shoreline. Japanese officers watch from the ridges above, binoculars pressed to their eyes, their uniforms soaked with mist. Below, the horizon shimmers with a sight none of them fully comprehend. A fleet of American trucks gliding across the flooded shallows, wheels turning beneath the surface as if the ocean itself had grown a road. Engines hum, metal hulls slice through the surf. Dozens of DUKWs, half truck, half boat, crawl from sea to sand, carrying supplies, soldiers, barrels of fuel, and crates of ammunition. The officers whispered disbelief. Vehicles are not meant to float. Rivers, swamps, tides, these were once nature's allies, natural barriers to invasion. Now, they are no obstacle at all. Behind the roar of engines, a simple truth unfolds in silence. This war is no longer defined by courage alone. It is defined by movement. And America has made movement limitless. The rippling sound of engines merges with the surf, and with it begins a new chapter of the Pacific War. The Pacific War had always been a contest of distance, across a theater that spanned 1/3 of the planet. Victory depended not only on firepower, but on the ability to move men, machines, and supplies across an endless expanse of islands, reefs, and jungles. By early 1944, the American war machine had learned that every island conquered demanded an infrastructure of its own. Docks, depots, roads, and fuel lines that could breathe life into a campaign thousands of miles from home. For the United States, this was not merely a military challenge. It was an industrial philosophy. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Navy's Seabees, and civilian designers merged their efforts in an alliance of practicality and imagination. The result was a new kind of warfare, logistics as a weapon. The DUKW, a 6-wheeled amphibious truck derived from the GMC CCKW, became its quiet hero. Designed in 1942, it could traverse water and land with equal grace. 2.5 tons of cargo gliding from ship to shore without pause. It was not glamorous like a tank or feared like a bomber, but it embodied something deeper: the American capacity to turn imagination into utility. In the early stages of the war, supply was America's greatest weakness. At Guadalcanal and New Guinea, Marines had fought hungry, short of ammunition and medical support. Lessons were learned in the blood and mud of those islands. By 1944, under the guidance of General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz, the United States had become a master of amphibious coordination. Every assault was now a symphony of timing. Bombers softening defenses, landing craft delivering infantry, and DUKWs bridging the divide between ship and land. Japan, by contrast, was frozen in an older logic of warfare. Its armies, steeped in samurai ideals and imperial arrogance, prized endurance and discipline over mechanical adaptability. Their supply lines stretched thin across the Pacific, dependent on vulnerable convoys and manual porters. Japanese officers saw logistics as a support act, not as strategy. They could not imagine war as an engineering problem, and by the time they tried, the world had moved beyond their reach. When the Americans prepared to retake the Philippines, they brought not just men, but an entire civilization of machinery. Floating cranes, prefabricated docks, bulldozers, power generators, and thousands of DUKWs formed the arteries of an invasion powered by industry. MacArthur's promise, "I shall return," would not be fulfilled by rhetoric, but by fuel, steel, and rubber. Each amphibious truck that rolled into the surf was a promise made tangible. The Japanese observers on the ridges of Lingayen could not yet grasp the scale of what they were witnessing. To them, the DUKW seemed like a miracle of Western excess, unnecessary decadent, even absurd. They watched the trucks crawl from ship to sea to shore without unloading, each carrying tons of cargo as though gravity itself had surrendered. The very concept of a roadless advance defied everything they had been taught about military order. In their minds, war still moved at the pace of men and horses, but beneath the waves, the future was already moving. Silent, inevitable, unstoppable. The American system had transformed nature into infrastructure. The ocean, once a moat, had become a highway. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific, the WKW was the same. Unglamorous, unarmed, yet decisive. It symbolized a nation that saw no limit between invention and necessity. Every rivet was a statement of democracy's power to produce, to improvise, to adapt faster than tyranny could imagine. As dawn rose over the Philippines, Japan faced not just an enemy, but an idea. That freedom, when industrialized, could conquer any terrain. The sound of engines in the surf would haunt them long after the battle ended. In the years leading up to the Pacific War, the difference between Japan and the United States was more than economic. It was philosophical. Japan's empire, built on conquest and ritual obedience, measured strength by the will to endure. America measured strength by the ability to create. When war came, one nation relied on discipline. The other relied on design. By 1943, Japan's forces had reached their geographic limits. Supply convoys from the home islands were bleeding under submarine attack. The Imperial Japanese Army, stretched from China to New Guinea, faced a brutal truth. Every ton of rice, every crate of ammunition, every barrel of fuel had to travel across seas they no longer controlled. The Pacific was both their empire's foundation and its trap. When American submarines began to cut off shipping routes, Japanese soldiers on the front lines starved, not for lack of courage, but for lack of transport. Horses and human porters carried shells through mud. Vehicles broke down in jungles with no spare parts. The empire that had dreamed of mechanized dominance was collapsing under the weight of its own distance. Across the ocean, American engineers were building bridges to nowhere, bridges that could float, fold, or vanish. Amphibious doctrine, once theoretical, had become a reality. The DUKW was only one piece of a vast logistical puzzle that included LSTs, landing ship, tank, pontoon causeways, and Bailey bridges. These innovations turned the Pacific Islands into stepping stones, each connected by an invisible network of planning and supply. Every advance was a calculation of tonnage, fuel, and distance. Mathematics in motion. In Hawaii, Australia, and the Marianas, training camps prepared soldiers not only to fight, but to build. The Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, embodied this new ethos. Their motto, "We build, we fight," captured a revolution in warfare. They laid airstrips within days, raised docks under enemy fire, and turned coral reefs into functional ports. When the first DUKWs hit the beaches of the Philippines, they were not improvisations. They were the culmination of 2 years of logistical evolution. Meanwhile, Japanese planners continued to trust terrain as their ally. Rivers, jungles, and monsoon swamps were expected to slow the enemy. They did not imagine a machine that could glide over both. When word spread of the American trucks that swim, disbelief mingled with fear. Prisoners of war described vehicles that seemed half-living, churning through mud, carrying food, ammunition, even artillery shells directly from transport ships to frontline units. The Imperial General Staff dismissed many such reports as exaggeration until they saw them themselves. When the invasion of Luzon began, over 900 DUKWs participated in the assault. Each carried its load through waves 6 feet high, over reefs that would have splintered traditional landing craft. Once ashore, they continued inland, crossing rivers and delivering cargo where no road existed. The Japanese had prepared their defenses for a linear assault. What they faced instead was fluidity, an enemy that could appear anywhere the tide reached. In Japanese post-war reports, officers described their shock. Colonel Kiyotake Kawaguchi, veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign, later wrote that the Americans had dissolved geography itself. It was not their tanks or planes that frightened him most, but the way they could move, how every piece of the battlefield seemed connected by machinery, how supply and assault were one seamless act. In that realization lay Japan's strategic defeat. Behind the mechanical miracle was a deeper ideology, the American belief that technology should serve the common soldier. Every truck, every crane, every prefabricated bridge was designed to save lives by saving time. It was a democracy of motion, the empowerment of ordinary men through extraordinary tools. Where Japan worshipped sacrifice, America worshipped efficiency. And in modern war, efficiency proved the greater faith. By early 1945, as the Americans advanced toward Manila, the Japanese commanders no longer asked how many divisions opposed them. They asked how many trucks. The sound of engines became a prophecy of inevitable loss. The DUKW, gliding from surf to sand, had become more than a vehicle. It was a declaration that even the sea could be conquered, not by arrogance, but by ingenuity. Every war is a story of perception. In the Pacific, Japan's officers entered combat with a vision shaped by centuries of insularity and a rigid code of martial honor. They saw themselves as heirs to the samurai, standing upon moral superiority, where courage and sacrifice could transcend material weakness. When they faced the Americans, they expected decadence, a society too soft, too commercial, too dependent on machines to fight without spirit. But as the campaign unfolded, it was not American bravery that stunned them. It was American abundance. The DUKW became a paradox in motion, a machine both absurd and terrifying. For the Japanese, it embodied the industrial democracy they could not understand, a system where invention was not reserved for elites, but born from the collaboration of workers, engineers, and soldiers. The truck was not elegant. It was not ceremonious. It was practical, adaptable, and relentless. Each one represented 1,000 unseen hands back home, working in synchronized rhythm. Mechanics in Detroit, welders in Pittsburgh, farmers producing rubber and steel. What the Japanese observed on those beaches was not merely a vehicle, but a civilization in motion. The first angle was technological. The DUKW's design defied expectations. A watertight hull, a propeller driven by the same engine as its wheels, a system of bilge pumps and adjustable tire pressure that let it float across tides and climb over dunes. It blurred the line between land and sea. Its creation by the National Defense Research Committee and General Motors engineers showed the American genius for adaptation, a willingness to merge military and civilian innovation without hierarchy. Japan's industrial system, constrained by bureaucracy and hierarchy, could not match such fluidity. Their vehicles were designed in isolation, their ships and tanks built by distinct ministries that rarely cooperated. America's DUKW, by contrast, was the offspring of unity, of science and necessity aligned. The second angle was tactical. Amphibious warfare demanded rhythm, not just courage. Every landing required continuous supply under fire, and the DUKW was the instrument that made it possible. On the beaches of Leyte and later Okinawa, waves of these trucks formed a living bridge between sea and shore. They could deliver ammunition to front lines, evacuate wounded soldiers, and carry fresh troops across flooded terrain. Japanese observers, trained to defend choke points and coastal fortifications, were left disoriented. The enemy was no longer bound to predictable routes. There were no bottlenecks, no pauses, no moments of vulnerability. The Americans could move through geography as if rewriting it. The third angle was psychological. Japan's officers experienced a subtle, corrosive shock, not in defeat, but in disbelief. The DUKW symbolized the collapse of the natural order they had trusted. Their doctrine had taught them that terrain, weather, and willpower shaped battle. But here, nature itself had betrayed them. Rivers once considered impassable became transit routes. Flooded rice fields that should have slowed armor instead became smooth paths for amphibious trucks. Each new American landing chipped away at the myth of spiritual supremacy. The Japanese soldiers still fought with fanatical devotion, but devotion could not bridge oceans or carry artillery shells through mud. For the first time, officers began to sense that valor alone was obsolete. The fourth angle was industrial. Behind every DUKW stood a staggering scale of production. Over 21,000 built between 1942 and 1945. No single island could isolate America from its factories. Each truck was replaceable, each loss insignificant in the vast arithmetic of democracy. Japan, by contrast, treated every weapon as precious, every machine as irreplaceable. Their factories were small, their materials scarce, and their labor divided between the Army and Navy's competing demands. To lose a truck or a tank was to lose a fragment of the nation's hope. To America, it was a statistic. The DUKW thus became not merely a vehicle, but a manifestation of industrial inevitability, a symbol of how a free economy could outproduce an empire. The fifth angle was human. American soldiers loved the DUKW not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. They called it the Duck. It carried them to safety, ferried supplies, even served as makeshift ambulances or floating command posts. In their letters home, they described it with affection, humor, and awe. A friend that never failed them. Japanese intelligence, intercepting such reports, mistook the casual tone for weakness, unable to grasp how affection for a machine could coexist with lethal efficiency. But this was the essence of the American soldier's experience, a union of technology and trust. The DUKW was not worshipped, it was used, and that distinction defined the democratic spirit. The sixth and final angle was moral. The DUKW did not exist to glorify war. It existed to make war bearable, to sustain life amid destruction. It carried food and medicine as often as ammunition. It blurred the boundary between offense and relief. In its engine's hum was an echo of humanitarian purpose, a reminder that victory, to the Americans, was not merely about conquest, but about survival and reconstruction. To the Japanese, whose ideology sanctified death over surrender, this practicality seemed soulless. Yet in the end, it was this pragmatism that would rebuild the world. And so, as the DUKWs moved across the flooded plains of Luzon, the Japanese officers saw more than machinery. They saw the collapse of their assumptions. In the churn of the water and the grinding of gears, they heard the voice of a modern age, one that spoke not of swords or flags, but of factories and freedom. The tide had turned not with thunder, but with engines, and it was only the beginning. There was another dimension to the astonishment that rippled through Japanese ranks in those final years of the Pacific War. An ideological angle. To the imperial command, technology was a tool of empire, not an expression of equality. Machines were built to extend the will of the emperor, not the will of the people. But the Americans saw their machines as extensions of their citizens. Each DUKW, each Liberty ship, each bulldozer was a creation of collective effort, the output of millions of anonymous workers who believed their labor had meaning. The vehicle rolling from the surf was not an emblem of one man's divine right. It was a chorus of democracy made mechanical. The DUKW symbolized a worldview where every individual contribution mattered. Each bolt tightened in a Midwestern factory was connected to a bridge built on a distant shore. When Japanese officers watched these trucks rise from the water, they were witnessing not simply an enemy's technical advance, but a moral one, a manifestation of shared purpose that transcended hierarchy. This was the invisible force that their empire, built on obedience, could not match. For a nation taught to sacrifice the self for the whole, it was disorienting to see a rival whose strength came from empowering the individual. There was also the environmental angle, the war's geography itself. The Pacific was a world of water. Lagoons, mangrove swamps, flooded plains, and rivers that turned to mud under monsoon rain. Nature, in its rawest form, had always been Japan's ally in defense. The commanders at Leyte and Luzon believed the terrain would slow the enemy, that the Americans would drown in the very seas they sought to cross. But the DUKW defied that faith. It turned floods into pathways and storms into opportunities. American engineers had not merely adapted to nature, they had domesticated it. The sea was no longer a barrier, it was infrastructure. To the Japanese, the Pacific was sacred, mysterious, elemental. To the Americans, it was a logistical equation to be solved. The strategic angle followed naturally. By early 1945, U.S. amphibious warfare had evolved into an art of mobility. On every front, from Normandy to Iwo Jima, American commanders synchronized naval, air, and ground forces through a common supply rhythm made possible by trucks like the DUKW. This seamless flow allowed divisions to fight continuously, with minimal delay. Japan's strategy, built on defense in depth and attrition, could not withstand such continuity. A battle could be planned, but not paused. A retreat could be ordered, but never organized. The Doku made pauses irrelevant. It carried war forward without interruption, eroding the value of fortifications and static defense. The Japanese generals soon realized they were fighting not an army, but a process that renewed itself faster than it could be destroyed. Then came the emotional angle, the quiet humiliation of realization. Among captured officers and surviving witnesses, there were descriptions not of hatred, but of awe. One Japanese engineer later confessed that when he saw American trucks driving through waist-deep water, he felt as if the ocean had betrayed us. For soldiers raised to worship sacrifice, to see technology liberate men from suffering was both wondrous and unbearable. They had been taught that hardship was virtue. The Americans, by contrast, believed that solving hardship was progress. This divergence went beyond tactics. It was a moral chasm. One culture sanctified endurance, the other innovation. And on the beaches of the Philippines, innovation won. Finally, there was the symbolic angle. Throughout the campaign, the DUKW's engine hum became more than mechanical noise. It was a rhythm of inevitability, a pulse of democracy echoing through the tropics. Its presence on the horizon signaled not only the arrival of supplies, but of an idea that freedom could manifest as efficiency, that abundance could serve purpose, that machinery could carry values as surely as soldiers carried flags. For the Japanese, the sound was foreign, a reminder that modernity belonged to those who embraced cooperation over command. For the Americans, it was the sound of assurance, of a system that worked because everyone believed it could. By the war's end, the DUKW had done more than deliver supplies. It had delivered a lesson in how civilizations wage war. The empire that glorified sacrifice was undone by a republic that glorified problem-solving. Japan's military brilliance could win battles. America's mechanical wisdom would win the war. On those rain-soaked shores, the sight of a truck floating through the tide captured the essence of 20th century warfare. It was not about whose soldiers were braver, but whose system could build more bridges, even those that ran beneath the sea. And in that moment, as the DUKWs rolled ashore in endless procession, the Japanese officers standing on the cliffs above Luzon realized that the modern world no longer belonged to warriors. It belonged to builders. January 9, 1945. The Gulf of Lingayen. It was the largest amphibious landing since Normandy. Over 175,000 American troops, under General Douglas MacArthur, surged toward Luzon, the heart of the Philippines. For the Japanese defenders, led by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, the invasion marked the beginning of the end. Yet, even Yamashita could not foresee that the decisive blow would come not from artillery or bombers, but from an unassuming fleet of amphibious trucks. The morning air was thick with cordite and rain. The sea, whipped by monsoon winds, churned into a boiling gray. Offshore, a floating city of American warships and transports stretched to the horizon. The first waves of Higgins boats had already stormed the beaches, carving paths through the sand with bayonets and bulldozers. But then, through the fog and smoke, came something different. Hundreds of UKWs descending from cargo ships, their bows dipping into the surf like obedient beasts of burden. From the cliffs near San Fabian, Japanese officers peered through rangefinders. They expected chaos, drowned trucks, jammed landings, confusion. Instead, they saw order. The amphibious convoy moved with choreographed precision. One line unloaded artillery shells, another carried fuel drums, a third ferried engineers with portable bridges and radio masts. No port, no dock, no pause. Supplies flowed directly from ships to shore, synchronized with the infantry advance. It was a vision of industrial serenity amid the apocalypse. MacArthur's command had learned from every island before. At Leyte, storms had ruined dock construction, forcing troops to wade through surf to unload supplies by hand. At Luzon, the DUKWs changed everything. They created a living bridge between the fleet and the land, keeping the invasion fed, armed, and mobile despite treacherous weather. For days, they shuttled back and forth, 24 hours a day, through tides and monsoon downpour, delivering 90% of all supplies required for the first phase of the campaign. Without them, the entire invasion timetable would have faltered. To the Japanese, the sight was disorienting. Their own vehicles sat stranded inland, out of fuel, their transport system shattered by American air supremacy. Yamashita's troops had to drag supplies by hand through flooded plains. Meanwhile, the Americans seemed to defy geography itself. Rivers that had once taken days to cross were now traversed in minutes. Entire battalions appeared where they were least expected, not marching, but gliding, borne by the ducks. The clash between two philosophies of war could not have been more vivid. The Japanese army, rooted in the ethos of Bushido, believed hardship purified the warrior. The Americans believed hardship was an engineering problem to be solved. When a Japanese officer looked through his field glass that morning, he saw both a defeat and a revelation: that progress had become its own weapon. Reports from the Japanese 14th Area Army described their shock in almost poetic terms. "They came from the sea without ships," one captain wrote in his diary. "We thought them demons, walking on water." Another report, filed by an engineering staff officer, noted with bitterness that the enemy's vehicles swim like fish and breed like insects. These were not exaggerations. They were metaphors born of disbelief. The impossible had become routine. As the battle unfolded, the DUKWs advanced deeper inland, crossing the swollen Agno River and the marshes beyond. They carried artillery pieces that would normally have been delayed for days. They ferried entire platoons through submerged terrain, sometimes under fire, their engines roaring defiantly through the flood. The Japanese counterattacks, brave but uncoordinated, could not halt this tide of movement. Every attempt to destroy a bridge or mine a road was meaningless. The Americans no longer needed roads. In the command caves near Baguio, Yamashita listened to fragmentary reports from the front. His staff officers spoke of enemy vehicles that seemed immune to the terrain. His own supply convoys were collapsing under strafing and exhaustion. "The enemy does not pause," one aide recorded him saying. "They move as though the earth itself carries them forward." It was the sound of realization that Japan was no longer fighting an army, but an age. By the end of January, the U.S. 6th Army had pushed 40 miles inland. supported by an uninterrupted logistical chain. Every gallon of fuel, every shell, every meal that reached the front had passed through the hands or the wheels of the wwii. Their engines never stopped, day or night. They crossed rivers swollen by rain, ferried over bridges made of water, and returned to the sea to reload. They were not glamorous, but they were unstoppable. The quiet heartbeat of modern warfare. For the Japanese watching from the shadows of the jungle, the humiliation was total. Their codes of honor, their faith in endurance, their mastery of terrain, all undone by trucks that refused to sink. The Empire's myths dissolved in the roar of American engines and the hiss of water against steel. That day at Lingayen, the war changed. It was no longer about who held the high ground, but who controlled the flow of energy, of motion, of supply. And in that new reality, Japan was already defeated. By mid-February 1945, the amphibious convoys had pushed the limits of what even American engineers thought possible. The DUKWs were no longer just tools of transport. They had become instruments of tempo, the measure by which the entire campaign moved. The roadless regions of Luzon, carved by rivers and monsoon swamps, might have stopped any other army. Instead, they became arteries of advance. When the roads turned to liquid, the trucks simply floated forward. The Japanese defenders fell back toward the interior, seeking high ground in the Cordillera Mountains. General Yamashita divided his forces into three pockets: Shobu, Kembu, and Shimbu groups, each tasked with delaying the inevitable. But his orders met the friction of reality. His troops could not resupply. Fuel was gone. Ammunition had to be carried by hand through flooded valleys. The Americans, meanwhile, advanced with unbroken momentum. Where a river crossed their path, DUKWs carried bridge sections and bulldozers. Where mud swallowed wheels, the same trucks became ferries. It was warfare reimagined as continuity. A single convoy could deliver what once required a port. In one recorded instance, the 592nd Amphibious Truck Company moved 700 tons of supplies across the Agno River in less than a day. A feat of logistics invisible to the headlines, but decisive in the field. The Japanese officers who captured fragments of these movements could hardly believe the reports. To them, the Americans seemed to exist in constant motion, as if the war itself had acquired an engine. The contrast reached its starkest form in the battles for the Central Plains. Japanese positions near Clark Field and Fort Stotzenberg were built to withstand conventional assault. Trenches, bunkers, and tank traps were arranged to funnel infantry into kill zones. But the Americans did not come in linear waves. They arrived through water. DUKWs slipped into flooded irrigation ditches and bypassed defenses entirely, delivering Sherman tanks and artillery pieces where there were no roads. The Japanese lines, designed for geometry, collapsed under fluidity. This was the turning point, not just in terrain, but in consciousness. For the first time, Japan's senior officers began to articulate the unspoken truth that had haunted them since 1943, that their nation could no longer keep pace with modernity. War had become an equation of supply, and America had rewritten the formula. In Tokyo, the General Staff received reports from Luzon describing an enemy sustained by machines that ignore nature. One staff memorandum, later discovered in post-war archives, lamented that our courage exceeds theirs, but their tools exceed courage. By March, the DUKWs had pushed beyond their expected role. They were now supporting combat operations directly, ferrying ammunition during firefights, evacuating wounded under enemy artillery, even serving as floating gun platforms. Soldiers began to rely on them as extensions of survival itself. "If you see a duck," one sergeant wrote in his field journal, "you know you're not forgotten." That faith, that an unseen system would always deliver, became the quiet strength of the American soldier. It was not blind patriotism, but trust in a machine that worked. In the villages around Manila, the Japanese retreat turned chaotic. Flooded rivers and demolished bridges that should have slowed, the Americans only accelerated their pursuit. Trucks rolled through submerged streets, their wheels half hidden, engines echoing through the ruins of the city. Civilians watched from rooftops as these amphibious convoys flowed past, like processions of steel. For many Filipinos, it was the first tangible sign that liberation had arrived. For the Japanese garrison, it was the final confirmation that their isolation was complete. The Battle of Manila would rage on, brutal and unforgiving. Buildings collapsed, fires devoured districts, and tens of thousands perished. Yet amid the destruction, the DUKWs remained constant, ferrying the wounded from riverside hospitals, carrying refugees to safety, and bringing in supplies through waterways choked with debris. In a war defined by dehumanization, these machines became paradoxical symbols of endurance and compassion. To Japanese officers captured in the aftermath, the shock did not fade. In interrogations, several spoke of the amphibious trucks as omens of an age they could never reach. One colonel described them as roads that follow orders. Another, in a moment of rare candor, said, "We fought with courage. They fought with creation." It was the recognition that a civilization of builders had defeated a culture of warriors. In this realization lay the climax of the Pacific War. Not the mushroom clouds that would come later, but this quiet collapse of certainty. The DUKWs had made visible what Japan's leaders had refused to see: that industrial democracy could wage total war without losing its soul. The Americans had weaponized abundance. Their factories were their arsenals, their blueprints, their strategies. They had turned imagination into infrastructure. By the time the Americans raised their flag over Manila in March 1945, the war's outcome was already sealed. Japan's armies still fought, but their nation's future had vanished beneath the waves where the DUKWs once rolled. The machines did not merely carry cargo. They carried the weight of an idea: that progress, once unleashed, cannot be stopped by tradition. On those flooded Philippine plains, the empire of the rising sun met not its conqueror, but its replacement, the mechanical democracy of the modern age. The sound of the engines lingered in the humid air, a hymn of movement, of freedom, of faith in creation over destruction. When the Battle of Luzon ended in August 1945, the Japanese 14th Area Army lay in ruins. Nearly 230,000 Japanese troops were dead, starved, or captured, victims not only of combat, but of immobility. General Yamashita's final positions in the Cordillera Mountains had become tombs of isolation. His men had food enough for weeks, ammunition for days, and no transport to move either. Their defeat was less an event than an erosion, a slow starvation of motion. On the American side, the campaign revealed something extraordinary: the first true expression of logistical supremacy as a decisive weapon. What Napoleon had once called the art of moving armies had evolved into an exact science. The DUKW was not a miracle machine, but a symbol of that science. The visible proof that the United States had mastered time and terrain through coordination, not chance. Every drop of gasoline, every ration, every bullet was traceable through an invisible chain stretching from the factories of Michigan to the front lines of Luzon. Historians would later note that in this campaign, America consumed over 600,000 gallons of fuel per day, much of it delivered directly by amphibious vehicles. No previous army in history had ever moved so much material so efficiently. The logistical web was alive, and its lifeblood was movement, a principle the DUKW embodied perfectly. To the Japanese prisoners, the lesson was crushing. Many had never seen such machinery up close before capture. They walked among rows of the amphibious trucks lined along the beach, engines cooling, metal glistening with salt. Some touched the hulls in silence, as if confronting a creature from another world. For them, this was not just military defeat. It was the death of an era. The Meiji dream of matching Western modernity through spirit alone had evaporated. The DUKW, unassuming and practical, had proven that modern power was not built on mysticism, but on mastery of process. In post-war interrogations, one Japanese colonel, Shigeru Nakajima, described his reaction. "We had fought the sea for centuries, believing it belonged to the gods. They built machines that defied it." Another officer wrote in his memoirs that he felt a sorrow deeper than fear, realizing that Japan's faith in endurance had blinded it to evolution. The Americans, he noted, had made the impossible routine. The consequences rippled beyond the battlefield. The American amphibious doctrine perfected in the Philippines became the template for post-war operations and reconstruction. Trucks like the DUKW would later deliver food and medicine in Europe after the war, then serve in Korea, and even in civilian disaster relief. In the Philippines itself, many were repurposed by the locals for trade and transport. Reminders that machines of war could also rebuild peace. The Japanese, meanwhile, began a painful introspection. When the war ended, engineers and officers studying captured American equipment found in it a logic they had long dismissed: modularity, interchangeability, repairability. The DUKW, simple yet ingenious, demonstrated that true power lay in systems, not symbols. The Empire's devotion to aesthetic perfection, its Zero fighters, its ceremonial swords, had produced beauty without resilience. America's utilitarian designs, born of democracy and mass production, produced victory. On the beaches of Lingayen, the tide returned to calm, erasing the tracks of invasion. But the image endured. Columns of ducks rolling from sea to shore, their wheels dripping with salt water, their cargo bays filled with fuel, grain, and hope. That vision haunted the defeated officers who had witnessed it. They understood too late that industrial freedom had defeated imperial pride. The DUKW was not merely an amphibious truck. It was a declaration that a society united by common purpose could outpace one united by command. It proved that the engine of democracy could run even across water. As the last prisoners were marched from the mountains, the sound of engines fading in the distance marked more than surrender. It marked the transition of power from the warrior to the worker, from empire to industry, from myth to mechanism. In the months that followed Japan's surrender, the amphibious trucks that had once symbolized invasion took on a gentler duty. Many DUKWs remained in service across the Pacific, repainted and retooled for peace. They carried food to starving villages in the Philippines, ferried supplies to hospitals, and hauled debris from ruined harbors. To those who had once feared them, the same vehicles now delivered survival. What had begun as instruments of war became, in the truest sense, instruments of renewal. For the United States, the lesson of the amphibious campaign was codified into doctrine. The U.S. Army and Navy issued studies on over-the-shore logistics, recognizing that mobility, not firepower, had defined victory. Reports circulated among Allied headquarters describing the DUKW as the most efficient supply vehicle ever designed for amphibious warfare. Engineers marveled that its six-wheel-drive chassis, paired with propeller propulsion, had functioned in both the coral shallows of the Pacific and the icy waters of the Rhine. It had bridged the world's two greatest wars with quiet consistency. The post-war world inherited this philosophy of motion. America's Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of Europe and Asia, and the birth of modern global logistics all carried the same genetic code: efficiency, adaptability, and the belief that technology could serve humanity as it had served victory. The DUKW's descendants, Larks, LVTs, amphibious transports, extended that legacy. Even decades later, during natural disasters and floods, the same silhouette could be seen gliding across water, its utilitarian grace unchanged. In Japan, the shock of defeat transformed into introspection. The nation that had once worshipped rigidity now learned to embrace flexibility. Post-war reconstruction demanded the very virtues that wartime ideology had rejected: openness to innovation, respect for engineers, and faith in collective effort. When Japan rebuilt its industries in the 1950s and 60s, many of its engineers cited admiration for the simplicity and ingenuity of American wartime designs. The DUKW, studied in captured blueprints and photographs, became a quiet influence, a model of function over form, practicality over pride. The same nation that once viewed it as an emblem of humiliation now saw in it a path toward renewal. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States demobilized its armies but kept the memory of its logistics alive. Veterans remembered the duck with fondness, even reverence. To them, it symbolized reliability, the steady hum of engines that never abandoned them, even in the worst seas or deepest mud. War correspondence and memoirs spoke of it as the friend that followed us anywhere. In the Smithsonian archives, photographs capture rows of DUKWs waiting at dawn, their hulls half in water, half on land, a mechanical metaphor for the threshold between destruction and reconstruction. Historians would later argue that Japan's surrender was inevitable once its logistical inferiority became clear. But inevitability is too sterile a word. What truly changed the course of the Pacific War was not fate, but philosophy. The DUKW's amphibious grace symbolized the merging of imagination and practicality, the American conviction that any obstacle, physical or moral, could be engineered into submission. That conviction did not end with war. It became the foundation of post-war optimism. In steel and rivets lay the idea that progress could serve peace as efficiently as it had served conquest. By 1946, the once feared machines were being sold as surplus. Many found new homes in civilian ports, rescue brigades, and transport companies. A few ended up in Japan, purchased by entrepreneurs rebuilding coastal trade. There is irony in that. The same machines that shattered Japan's defenses now helped restore its economy. But perhaps that was the most fitting conclusion of all. The DUKW had always symbolized adaptation, the power to move between worlds, to float between purposes, to turn war's tools into peace's instruments. For the Japanese officers who had watched those first landings at Lingayen Gulf, the memory lingered. Some would later write that the hum of those engines had never left them. It was the sound of a civilization they had underestimated, one that valued not submission, but cooperation, not destiny, but design. And so, as the Pacific tides washed away the scars of battle, the legend of the amphibious truck endured. A simple machine that carried within it the blueprint of modern power. Its legacy was not only in what it conquered, but in what it built after the conquest was done. The ocean has long since swallowed the echoes of those engines. The beaches of Lingayen lie quiet now, washed smooth by 70 years of tides. Yet, somewhere beneath the surface, the story still stirs. The story of how machines once moved through water as if guided by purpose, and how men, in watching them, saw the future rise from the sea. The DUKW was never built for glory. It bore no insignia of conquest, no emblem of pride. Its purpose was motion, pure, unbroken, unhesitating motion. It turned chaos into rhythm, distance into possibility. To the Japanese officers who saw it glide ashore in 1945, it seemed to violate nature itself, but in truth, it only expressed a different kind of nature: the human drive to adapt, to create. to refuse the limits that geography or fear might impose. That was the quiet miracle of democracy in wartime. The idea that progress could be born from cooperation, that a truck could symbolize more than steel and wheels. It could symbolize faith in ingenuity. The DUKW carried no banners, yet it embodied a nation's belief that freedom is not stillness, but movement, not inheritance, but invention. Its engine's hum became the anthem of that belief. Low, constant, determined. It spoke of a people who trusted their builders as much as their soldiers, who saw no shame in solving instead of suffering. In its wake, the war's grand illusions dissolved. The empire that worshipped endurance faced a republic that worshipped improvement. And in that contest, improvement endured. When the Japanese officers watched those trucks drive through the flood and vanish into the jungle, they were not only witnessing defeat, they were witnessing transition, the moment when the 20th century turned from empire to modernity. The DUKW was its vessel, its metaphor, its bridge between the world that was and the world that would come. Today, its rusting hulls rest in museums or riversides, quiet reminders that even the simplest machine can change the direction of history. For in every turning wheel, in every ripple it left upon the water, the DUKW carried a single enduring message: that freedom, like movement, cannot be stopped once it begins.